Well, you would have seen all of the conversations around our democracy, the strength of our democracy ahead of our elections. And in the country at the moment is someone who believes that this year could in fact be the year that around the world, democracy, to use her phrase, could fall off a cliff. Her name is Maria Ressa. She's the co-founder of the reporting group Rappler in the Philippines. But she also is a co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 for her work in unveiling what was going on in her home country. She joins us now. Maria Ressa, it's an honor to meet you, ma'am. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. This is great.
So you say you believe this could be the year that democracy falls off a cliff. Now, we have a series of important elections. We think of our own. But Indonesia later this week, Pakistan last week.
Right.
We have India, of course, and then the oldest democracy, the United States.
Yeah,
Why do you believe democracy is in such danger now?
You know, this is data-driven. In the 2021 Nobel lecture, I actually pointed out that we now live in an environment where big tech has essentially taken over the gatekeeping powers, right? And as early as 2018, lies spread 6 times faster than facts on social media. So this is what I'm calling big tech at that point, right? This is before ChatGPT was rolled out in November 2022. If lies spread 6 times faster, in the Philippines, we saw that if it's laced with fear, anger, and hate, that it spreads even faster than that. So if you don't have integrity of facts, how are you going to have integrity of elections? And we've seen this all around the world. 2024 was the year, you have to call it like the banner election year. More than 50 countries around the world, you mentioned some of them, but the EU has elections this year, in addition to all of the largest democracies are having elections. So how are we voting? Are we being insidiously manipulated? If geopolitical power countries can actually go to the cellular level of a democracy, people, and insidiously manipulate us, do we have integrity of elections?
It's amazing to me in a way because when I was growing up as a sort of younger journalist than I am now, I always thought that the more information the people had, the better it would be. And I would suggest that probably in most democracies there is more transparency now than ever before. In our own country, I think it's harder to keep a secret now than it's ever been. And yet, that hasn't resulted, in my view at least, in voters making better choices.
Well, not at all, because it isn't that more information, it's not all the same. Again, the difference between a fact and a lie, right? My generation would go online and think, well, I saw it online, it must be true, but that's not correct anymore, because when technology took over as gatekeepers of the public information ecosystem, they actually used a new business model called surveillance capitalism. That is database, right? And that data essentially allows them to clone each of us and to take our weakest moment to a message and micro-target this. Look, South Africa was among the first to point out what Bell Pottinger did here, right? And those were using meta-narratives that were meant to incite fear, hatred, anger. This is happening all over the world, and commensurate with that, as that is happening, you're seeing also the rise of digital authoritarians. Sweden's VDEM actually pointed out as early as last year, 72% of the world is now under authoritarian rule. You know, having said that, I'm in South Africa because we're looking for hope.
Yes.
And South African elections are interesting because of the way your system is set up, but also because you've gone through this period you're calling state capture, right? But again, the Bell Pottinger was an incredible one because it wasn't just South African corruption. It was corruption linked to India, to a family in India, because when they gain power, they don't stay in their own countries, right? So this is a global problem, and now you have to add TikTok.
Yeah.
What's the penetration rate of TikTok in South Africa? Because that data, when you have less, when you keep scrolling and you have less control over what you choose to see, that means they get more of your data.
Are there signs that you can look at and think in a democracy, this democracy is in trouble? And I mean, in the United States, if I were to use the United States as an example, issues that should not be political issues at all. Abortion should not be a political issue.
Right.
Gun control should not be a political issue. And yet these are what politicians are using to make people feel scared or feel that they're, I love this phrase, a very sort of white phrase, your way of life, you know, is under attack. It means all sorts of things.
Right. Fear, anger, and hate. But right off the top, if you are marginalized in the real world, you are further marginalized online. That's by design, right? About 300 Nobel laureates, civil society groups, different activists around the world. At the end of last year, we signed something called the 10-point action plan, and it had 3 buckets. The first is you have to stop surveillance for profit. The second, stop coded bias. This is big tech. And the third, journalism as an antidote to tyranny. You asked what are the goal of all of these information operations is to hit repeatedly, because when you say a lie a million times now on our new gatekeepers, that lie becomes a fact, right? When you when you hit the fracture lines of society, it splinters apart, and that becomes fodder for the digital authoritarian, right? So all of these hot-button issues, again, you can see in the United States, it's race. In the Philippines, it was class, rich versus poor. Again, I go back to 2016. You guys were among the first to actually expose this. It was, again, race, right? So this is damaging at the core level, and we must do something about it. The key part here is legislation. The EU is ahead, the Digital Services Act is there, but I don't think enough of our people realize that we need to look at the data flows and the networks of disinformation.
Apart from throwing your phone away, and there are days when I feel that's the only thing you can do, are there ways you can protect yourself? And I mean, I know plenty of people who will say to me, they know I'm a journalist, and they'll say, I got this on WhatsApp, is it true? You know, and I think that so many people are looking at things on WhatsApp, and because it's from someone they know, it's a WhatsApp group of people with similar interests, people they're at school with, who they're in touch with 6 years later, whatever it is, they tend to, and I think this is human, we all tend to believe that more strongly.
No, that's correct. And this is very, very early, probably before 2016, a study showed that friends and family, that you will believe them 94% more than you would, say, a news organization, right? Anything that is formal, that is outside, you believe your family and friends more. And yet, that's also where disinformation spreads. What can we do? Move out of... Well, the first is, as journalists, expose this. We need to show how disinformation is impacting us at 3 levels. As people, right? It was only in May last year that the Surgeon General of the United States actually said that it has harmful effects on teenagers. Incidents of suicide, depression, lack of sleep, right? But beyond that, look at the impact on us. In the Philippines in 2016, I was getting an average of 90 hate messages per hour, right? Weaponization of social media followed by the weaponization of the law. In order to keep doing my job, I had to be okay with going to jail for more than a century. I mean, so I guess that's the first, is that the impact for people. The second is the impact on society. Making us distrust everyone, tearing us apart. If you only live on social media, you will believe in the worst of human nature. What happened to the best of who we are, right? That's the second. And then finally, think about evolution, right? The plasticity of our brains, and this is research that is coming out right now. It is only now that we're seeing the impact on the next generation. The difference between I'm a little older than you, but the difference between our generation and Gen Z, for example, there's a generational gap now. The kids who are growing up on social media. And it's even worse once they get to TikTok.
Is there any hope for journalism?
Oh
because,
my gosh.
I mean, you talk about it as the antidote, and I would agree with that. I mean, obviously I'm biased, and I have my own internal bias, but the fact is that journalism, I see it in this country all the time, is under more financial pressure than I think it's been in many, maybe ever, or certainly in the last sort of 30 years.
Yes.
Is there any hope for journalism? And I always think that business organizations, to make factually based decisions that will result in profit, are going to need journalism to survive.
You sound really logical and rational. That is the thinking slow part, right?
Yeah.
This is what democracies are based on. And yet this puts us in the thinking fast part, in the emotional, kind of instinctive, scarcity brain mode. Look, you asked, what can we do? I think the first is we need to move out of this, understand how this is distorting us, and then come into the real world. Journalists, will we survive this? Again, this goes hand in hand. The death of journalism, we are also at an existential point. And this, look at the bloodbath that's happened in the West.
Yeah.
Just the first part of January this year. Will we survive? We need a new business model. There's an upside. Rappler, because we were attacked by the government in 2018, we dropped 50% of our advertising revenue in 4 months, and we found another sustainable business model. So there is hope. But the second part is that if journalism, if news organizations die, then you're not going to be able to have democracy. These go hand in hand. And this is part of the reason we're coming. The World Movement for Democracy, which I chair, is actually coming to South Africa, right? This is part of our goal, to learn lessons, to bring 500 democracy activists together, journalists, understand that we need a whole of society approach to fight this, because this inflames the worst of us. And that isn't who we are.
I look at our country and reporting on our democracy. And for the most part, the conversations are, I mean, it's loud and it's rambunctious and it's wonderful and it's often quite constructive as well. I see what people tend to do is is that I think we do still respect the other point of view, and I think that's really important. When you look at our democracy compared to the other places you've been to, I mean, we don't have someone, sometimes we come close, but we don't have someone with the sort of support of Donald Trump, for example, who says the most terrible and insulting things. We do have people who can be similar. Do you see us as a democracy in danger? Do you see us as an encouraging democracy? How do you see us at the moment? It's too early to say.
I think an interesting, so you talked about WhatsApp, right? That is something that isn't actually, there are no data yet on this, right? But you only have, your social media penetration rate is only at 43%. When it was 43% for other countries around the world, the news organizations still were gatekeepers, right? But I'll look to Canada, because I looked at Canada when it was in its 40% penetration to 83 to 87% penetration. Once you get into the 80s, then disinformation goes more rampant, because the politicians use it, unfortunately, right? It is this corruption of our information ecosystem literally corrupts our values, turns it upside down by playing on our fears, and then you have no idea what is fact and fiction. South Africa is in a critical place. I think you have a very vibrant civil society. You can get ahead of the game by moving into the real world, by understanding the impact of big tech, and by guarding against it. Lots of bad things that have happened, right? And you've gone through it. I mean, to be honest, part of the reason I'm here is to try to understand what lessons we can learn.
Maria Ressa, thank you. It's been lovely to meet you. Really appreciate the time. Maria Ressa, of course, a co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021, CEO of the reporting group Rappler.